In this tutorial, I'm going to paint two tree scenes, one with white trees that we're going to mask out and one with dark trees against light. Okay, before I sketch this out, I want to do a little thumbnail because I got to get the positioning right of those trees. Now this photo is pretty good. The positioning is pretty good of the trees, but one of the problems is that they're the same width. So I'm going to have one tree here, that's the main tree. Then I'm going to have the second tree here, which I'm going to make the thin tree. And I'm going to put the third tree here, and that's going to be sort of halfway between the two thicknesses, also leaning in. What's important here is the principle of big, medium, and small. So this one's big, this one's medium, this one's small. That's a very good design principle to always think in big, medium, and small. And then the other thing you want to pay attention to is that the distances, this distance, and this distance, and this distance, and that one, and that one, and that one, that they're all different, that we don't get any symmetries between them. So we want to make sure this is probably a little bit too equal. So, we've got to make sure that these distances all have variations in them. That makes for much more interesting because the principle there is repetition with variation. So always aim to have variations in your widths, sizes, distances, and that will make a much more interesting painting. And then the third tree is going to be, as I said, I'm going to make sure you're going to move it maybe even further out here, creating a bigger distance here, and then sort of halfway between the two tree thickness, like that. So that's all quite different, and then we can then have the thinner trees here in the background. For painting, you can either use masking fluid, but I'm actually going to use tape. This is the middle tree. So I'm just gonna put that one there. And then that one, bigger tree. This tape is very old, so it's quite brittle. A little bit slower. Make this a bit wider by overlapping. Tear that one off there. Alright, I'm gonna cut this one. So, and before I start painting, I'm just gonna remove any other lines outside. So for this painting, I'm going to try brand new Princeton Aqua Elite that was sent to me by Princeton. So I'm going to give those a crack. They are like Kolinsky. I'm going to start with my sky color, and apologies that the palette's a little bit off screen. I'll move it into view in a couple of minutes once I realize that that's what's happening. And I'm using the biggest brush first. It is a big flat brush, and starting off with a light cerulean, and then I'm going to mix a bit of yellow into that blue and then go straight into the background tree foliage. I want to make sure that that's quite a light color, like a fresh color. The light is kind of diffused. There's no real source of light. So I wouldn't call it overcast, but you can't see, a specific light source. And then I'm going to drop in a bit of darker blue closer to the ground to create a bit of density in there. And now I'm mixing a lighter color for the foreground of my forest floor, which is just raw sienna that had a little bit of remnants of whatever pigment in that well as well. And then I've already pre-mixed a darker brown. Now, often I paint, lighter in the background and darker in the foreground. Here we're going to reverse it because where the ground meets the background trees is where we have the least amount of light because we're looking into a forest. So the canopy, the trees will block the light. so that it actually gets a bit darker towards the background. I'm kind of following the reference photo here. You can obviously change your light conditions as you see fit. And you can tell my brush is not the best brush to do big washes and loose wet in wet work. It doesn't hold a lot of water. It's not meant for that, but I'm kind of just pushing it to its limit. So I have to reload the brush a lot to get pigment onto my paper, especially because I didn't wet it to start with the paper. I'm painting on dry paper. And I'm going to drop in some of that green, the moss that's growing up the trees, but also onto the forest floor. And then before it dries, I'm adding some texture in the background. I'm not painting anything specifically. This is quite a loose and abstract painting, which is my style, as you know by now, and probably why you're following me or watching my videos. And I'm scratching in a few tree trunks in the background that has still a bit of moisture in it. And I'm also wanting to add a few splatters, but yeah, these brushes don't have a lot of water in them. It's very hard to even knock out some splatters here. Eventually I managed to get some texture into the foreground and background. I've got to add actually a fair amount of pigment onto that. And I'm using my right hand, which is my non-dominant hand. I'm a left-hander. But that is sometimes a great way to add random textures because you have, very little control of your non-dominant hand. So I sometimes paint with two hands simultaneously, especially when it's just creating textures and broad brush strokes like I've done there. There's still a little bit of moisture into my background trees, so I'm just going to darken that transition between the ground and the background. And that also allows me to scratch in some more of those trees, make them a bit stronger. And as a final addition to this first act of the painting, I'm going to drag in some darker tree trunks in the background as well. We got to create the illusion of quite a dense forest moving further back. But because there is still moisture in those light green trees in the sky, those lines here will diffuse still and soften out a bit so that we have the maximum contrast and sharpness once we put in those main trees. I've let that completely dry before I take the tape off. Don't make the mistake of pulling the tape off too soon. If you pull tapes off wet paper or masking fluid of wet or damp paper, it will damage the paper much more easily. Now I'm going to rub out some of the pencil lines that were there from my sketch. I don't need them. I probably didn't need them in the first place, but I still wanted to have a bit of a guide for my positioning of the tape. Better safe than sorry. That can be easily removed now. So now comes the main trick of the show, which is how I paint those trees. And that is that I paint a pretty dark, strong line on the shadow side of my trees. So I've decided there is a bit of light coming in from the left. That's where we do have a bit, of a difference. And as soon as I put that pigment down, I'm going to come in with a clean and damp brush. And then I just soften those edges. And I want to create a three-dimensional form of the trees. And because that pigment is really strong there on the right-hand side of my trees, it won't run too much. It won't bleed too much. And I also don't put oodles of water onto the left side of the trees. It's literally just a damp brush. And that's when synthetic brushes are good. Again, they don't hold too much water. With a natural hairbrush, I could have easily dumped a whole lot of water on there and made it run in every which direction. And I'm going to drop in a bit more texture, strengthen the shadow side, make sure my tree looks natural. It's not, thinner at the bottom and thicker at the top, which it's borderline. I've also anchored it to the ground by adding in a bit of green and connecting it with the moss that's already there. Same thing for the second tree. And in line with the principle of a repetition with variation, I'm using a slightly different color So I've just added in a bit more blue for this one, make it a bit more grey, and that it also recedes a bit further in the background than the main tree on the right side. But same deal, first strong pigment on dry paper and then dragging a wet brush alongside of it to soften that. This is something that I've shared in my latest watercolor workout newsletter. If you're on that, then you're familiar already. But because that's the theme of the week, I thought I'd do a proper demonstration for Patreon as well, which is that idea of creating mini gradients or graduated washes to give form to shapes. So this idea here with, strong dark pigment for the shadow side, and then simply dragging a wet brush alongside it. That works for rocks, that works for anything that has rounded dimensions, cylinders, spheres, apples, oranges, teacups, round buildings, anything like that. It's a great little technique to have in your repertoire to create 3 dimensions. I've done numerous tutorials also on YouTube already with painting rocks, probably also on Patreon if I had a look. I think I did one on rocks, which uses a similar technique. I'm going to strengthen some of the edges because we had masking tape there, so we want to make sure that we don't leave any white outlines. It's got to connect into the rest of the painting or it'll look like a cutout. That's always the danger with masking fluid or any type of masking, that when you take it away, it's like punched out. So same for figures, etc. I rarely do it. I usually paint around it. That gives me much more natural edges. But for this exercise, for trees that are quite straight, it was worthwhile doing so that I could paint very fluid and connected backgrounds. I've added some more thin trees in the background, just building up a bit of a pattern there, and now I'm adding a few shadows into my moss. I can't make the moss any brighter, but I can get a bit of shadow underneath it, so that also adds a bit of dimension. And same here, flicking in some stuff on the floor, leaves, branches, a little bit bigger in the foreground, and then making them smaller as we recede into the background. And other good way to create more dimension into your painting, following the rules of perspective. There we go. And then also allows me to create some leading lines connecting some pathways from the front to the back of the painting. And I felt there was one sort of counterbalance missing on that left side, so just putting in a darker tree. We still have, the rule of odds in the front with the 3 trees. The 4th tree I just painted there, the darker one, doesn't really count. It sits kind of between the foreground and the background, but just helps balancing the painting. A few final marks, and that one is done. Okay, let's move on to the second painting, and I'm just going to cover that left side there so that I don't mess it up too much while I'm painting. And the idea here is kind of the reverse of what we've just done, so dark trees against the background light. And same, I'm starting with my sky color, but now I've moved on to different brushes. It was too much of a struggle with the synthetic brushes to get a lot of wet and wet texture in there. And again, this is probably even more wet and wet than the one before, so I'm using my mop. And I'm going to move straight on to a yellow or sort of a light green. My yellow is a neutral one. It's a primary yellow, probably more on the lemony side. So you can use lemon yellow or cat light or whatever yellow that you like to work with. I want to create sort of the impression of an early morning. So I'm staying with cool light. Early morning light has more blue in it. Late afternoon is a warmer light. So sunsets and sunrises are different in that way. And I'm covering my whole page there and trying to leave a light source in the middle. It's got like a central light coming through. The sun's still quite low. So I'm going to remove a bit of my pigment there. And as this is wet, I'm now gonna build up a few tones. This is going to be darker in the foreground. That's going to help push us into the painting and make sure that we keep the light in the center there, as I'm pointing out quite vividly. So I'm just going to drop in darker greens, added some ultramarine into this mix as well. And again, making sure I'm staying a little bit on the cooler side. And I'm just going to vary my greens. This will dry a lot lighter, so I'm not too scared of adding lots and lots of pigment into there. I also added a bit of quinacridone gold that makes it a bit of a nicer green for me. Right, and then it's going up the sides as well. Even though I'm not too scared of adding more value, I want to make sure it's not getting too dark because we really rely on those light backlit trees to give us the contrast. I checked that it was dry, still has a bit of moisture in the paper, that's why it's buckling a bit, but it's dry enough for the paint not to run. Now I'm using my favorite tree brush, which has got quite a long bristles. I think it's a Raphael. It's rubbed off its brand name, but it's one of my favorite brushes to paint trees. You can also use a calligraphy brush, but anything with long bristles gives you these natural edges and shapes. And when I paint trees, and I'm putting that in air quotes, I don't really paint. I kind of flick my brush around and just let random movements and the texture of the paper and the long bristles of the brush kind of create these organic shapes. So I want to make sure that we have maximum contrast there in the middle. And there's also was a bit of a water stain there where the edges didn't dry as nice as I wanted to, so I'm going to plop a tree in the middle of it. Now, I'm not per se following a reference photo for this one. That's why I didn't show you one, because I don't have one. But it is a scene I've painted a few times, and it's almost abstract. So you can follow that same pattern and paint an unlimited amount of paintings with that same idea and change the shapes of the trees and the arrangements. But yeah, it's literally just a light background with a light source, and then create this two-layered treescape where the yellowy trees in the background are sunlit, and then we have the trees in the foreground that are much, much darker and creating sort of that silhouette effect. And to that extent, I'm just building up my tone, adding more blues, a bit of red. Red, of course, being the complementary color to green, so a great way to tone down your greens, make it darker, is using complementary colors in your mixes. And now I'm getting darker and darker to create that backlight effect. I'm working with such little water that my paintbrush stuck to the paint pan, as you could see. And this is all kind of done by feeling. As I said, I'm not really following a reference here. I just want to make sure I leave enough gaps in there for the yellow to come through and for the sky to come through, and working my way around that center point. That's where the main light's going to come. But also I want to leave enough room for my tree trunk shadows once those main trees go in. The foreground should be the darkest. So I'm just going to gauge how far in I go and how I'm going to craft this shape. I've let that completely dry again, and now we're coming to the main actors, which are the trees, just as in the first painting, but this time they are dark. So I'm mixing a value 9 or almost a 10, I'd say, with my blue and a bit of neutral tint, and well, it's a really dark green with burnt sienna, bit of yellow, ultramarine blue, and then some neutral tint as well. And that's a pasty mix, so that's almost like butter. And I'm going to start with the thinner trees first, just to get a practice run in and to loosen up my straight lines. And they can be broken, those lines. That's going to add to the effect of strong light breaking through, especially where the sun is. And then comes one of my main trees, pushing down my brush quite hard, and I'm using the whole length of the bristles, so not just the tip, but the body of the brush. And that's creating a dry brush effect because, yeah, the paint is so dry, it has virtually no water in it. And I'm going to go again with the big, medium, small approach. Make sure that the trees are different widths and also are not spaced equally, which I probably got the third tree, that thin one, a little bit too close. So those distances are almost the same. Could have done that a little bit better, but I may have just gotten away with it. And now I want to make sure that the light's radiating from the center, so my shadows will follow perspectives. So they're not all parallel lines, but they are radiating out from the center. There you go. And that will create the illusion of light coming through the middle there. You can see it's a pretty abstract painting in a lot of ways. We know what we're looking at, but it's just shapes and lines. That's the beauty about landscape painting. If you don't put in any man-made objects like houses or fence posts or animals, then it's a pretty abstract kind of way of painting. And these Princeton brushes have got a lovely edge at the back of the brushes, so I can use them to scratch in. And then I just added a few more lines. You can see a bit of a jump cut there, but I just added it in. The middle felt a bit bare, so I'm just going to add another thin glaze of my yellow just to fill that up a bit. Same there in the foreground. A bit of a nicer shape. A few more really dark bits in the foreground, adding a bit of the texture. Okay, here's a diptych of trees. Two variations of a forest scene. One with white trees and one with dark trees backlit from the sun. Now what's interesting is that actually this background is darker than this one. You'd think dark background and light trees, and light background and dark trees. This is dark trees against a darker background, but we have the source of light coming in here through this yellow. So that what sets them off, and the shadows creates that impression of sunlight. And here is more of an overcast day or a very filtered light, but we created enough contrast here and here, especially here, to make this tree stand out enough. Hope you will take this into your repertoire and paint trees from here on. Thank you very much.